What if the oldest texts on Earth were never meant to tell the whole story? What if the clay tablets pressed into existence 5,000 years ago, the ones we call the beginning of recorded history, were not recordings at all but selections? What if forgetting was not a failure of preservation, not the slow erosion of time and flood and fire, but a design? Tonight we return to the oldest written words that survive, not to the myths you may have heard retold, not to the grand narratives constructed by later generations, but to the fragments themselves, the actual texts, the silences they contain, and the question they quietly suggest, that humanity was never meant to remember everything, only what it needed to continue. So let the room grow dark, let the noise of the day fall away, and let us descend together into deep time, where memory itself begins to fracture. Before we begin, if this kind of careful exploration resonates with you, consider subscribing or leaving a like. It helps others find their way here, and if you'd like to be part of this quiet community, leave a comment below. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? We'd love to know you're here. The earliest writings we possess come from Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is where cities first rose from the mud, where irrigation canals were dug, where grain was stored in quantities large enough to require accounting, and where, sometime around 3200 BCE, the need to track these stores gave birth to writing. But when we open these earliest tablets, we do not find a complete picture. We find lists, quantities, names of goods, amounts of barley, numbers of animals. The script is called cuneiform from the Latin for wedge, because each mark was pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, leaving a wedge-shaped impression. The tablets were then baked, hardened, made permanent. And yet what was made permanent was not history, not in the way we think of it. What was preserved were fragments, details without context, names without stories, events without explanation. Take, for instance, the Sumerian king list. One of the most famous texts to survive. It purports to record the kings who ruled before and after a great flood, but the list does not explain, it does not narrate, it simply states. Before the flood, it says, kingship descended from heaven. Then it names cities, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. In each city a king ruled, and the lengths of their reigns are given. But these lengths are impossible. One king ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000 years. Then the flood came. The text says this plainly. The flood swept over, and after the flood, kingship descended again. New cities are named, new kings. Their reigns are still long, but shorter now, a few hundred years, a few dozen. Then, gradually, the numbers become human, plausible. But the text never explains the transition. It does not say why the early kings lived so long. It does not describe the flood in detail. It simply moves forward, as if the reader already knows, or as if the reader does not need to know. This is the first silence, not an absence caused by decay, but a silence that was always there. The text assumes something. It assumes that certain knowledge is already held, or that certain knowledge is not meant to be written, and this pattern repeats, again and again. In text after text, stories begin in the middle, characters appear without introduction, events occur without cause. The past is not a line, it is a series of islands, and the water between them is unmarked. Consider the creation myths. We have several from Sumer and the later Babylonian tradition. The Enuma Elish, the Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, each tells a story of beginnings, but none of them begin at the true beginning. They begin with gods already in existence, with a cosmos already structured, with forces already in motion. The Enuma Elish, composed later but drawing on older ideas, opens with the words, "When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. Already there are beings, Apsu, the fresh water, Tiamat, the salt water, Mumu, perhaps the mist or the in-between. The gods are born from their mingling." But where did Apsu and Tiamat come from? The text does not say. It begins with them, as if before them there was nothing, or as if what came before them cannot be spoken. The same is true for humanity. In several Sumerian texts, humans appear suddenly. They are created, yes, but the creation is described in functional terms, not metaphysical ones. In the myth of Enki and Ninmah, the gods are labouring, digging canals, clearing rivers. The work is endless and exhausting. The gods complain, they go on strike, and so Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, devises a solution. He will create a being to do the work instead. With the help of Ninmah, the mother goddess, he shapes humans from clay, from the earth itself. But the text does not describe a sacred act of divine breath. It describes a practical solution. Humans are made to serve, to carry the burden the gods no longer wish to bear. And once they are made, the story moves on. No question is raised about what this means. No reflection on the nature of humanity. The function is described. The purpose is clear. And that is enough. But there is something else in these texts, a recurring motif, a recurring theme that the scribes return to again and again across centuries. The idea that knowledge itself was restricted, that not everyone was meant to know everything, that wisdom was a possession, not a commons. In the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, the goddess of heaven descends to the realm of the dead. She passes through 7 gates. At each gate she must remove a piece of her regalia, a crown, a necklace, a garment. By the time she reaches the throne of Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, she is naked, stripped of all power, and Ereshkigal kills her, hangs her corpse on a hook. Inanna is only restored through trickery and sacrifice, but the text makes clear there are places even the gods cannot go without cost. There are thresholds that demand surrender, and the knowledge of what lies beyond those thresholds is not freely given. This idea that knowledge is bound, that it is gated, appears in the role of the scribes themselves. Writing in Sumer was not a common skill. It was the domain of a small elite. Boys, and occasionally girls, were trained in the Adaba, the tablet house, the school. They spent years learning the hundreds of cuneiform signs, memorizing word lists, copying myths, practicing contracts. It was a brutal education. One text, a Sumerian school dialogue, describes a student being beaten for speaking out of turn, for shoddy work, for arriving late. The teacher strikes him, the student weeps, but he continues. Because to become a scribe was to enter a class apart. Scribes did not labour in the fields. They did not dig canals. They sat in the shade and recorded. They controlled the flow of information. They decided what was written, and by deciding what was written, they decided what would be remembered. And they were not neutral. The scribes served the temple, they served the palace, they served power. The earliest tablets we have are not literature. They are receipts, tax records, loan agreements, inventories of goods stored in temple granaries. The temple controlled vast wealth. It employed workers. It loaned seed to farmers and expected repayment with interest. It owned land. And the scribes documented all of this. They made power visible. They made it enforceable. A debt recorded on clay could be carried forward through time. A contract could survive the death of the parties involved. Memory in this sense was not neutral. It was a tool, a mechanism of control. But the scribes also recorded myths, stories of gods and heroes, texts that, on the surface, seemed to have nothing to do with grain stores or labour obligations. And yet, even these texts carry a message. They describe a world in which hierarchy is natural, in which the gods rule and humans serve, in which obedience is expected and rebellion is punished. The myth of Atrahasis, one of the oldest flood narratives, tells the story of humanity's creation and near destruction. Humans are made to work. They multiply. They become noisy. The noise disturbs Enlil, the chief god. He cannot sleep, and so he decides to destroy them, first with plague, then with drought, then with famine. Each time the god Enki intervenes, teaching humanity how to survive, but finally Enlil sends a flood, a total annihilation. Only one man, Atrahasis, is warned by Enki. He builds a boat, he survives, and when the flood recedes, the gods realize they still need workers, so they allow humanity to continue, but they impose limits. Humans will now die. They will grow old. Women will sometimes be barren. Children will sometimes be stillborn. Pain and death are built into the structure of human life, not as punishments, exactly, but as controls, mechanisms to keep the population manageable, to keep the noise down, This is not a story of hope, it is a story of containment, and it was written down, copied, passed forward. Why? Because it explained the world as it was, because it justified suffering, because it made the structure of society seem inevitable, divinely ordained. If the gods themselves imposed these limits, then no human ruler could be blamed for them, no scribe, no priest. The story did not invite rebellion, it invited acceptance, and that too is a form of memory management. Not what to remember, but how to remember it, what meaning to attach, what emotions to feel. And yet there are gaps. Even in these carefully managed texts there are silences, events that are alluded to but never fully described. The flood, for instance, appears in multiple texts: the Sumerian king list, Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, later in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But none of them explain what caused it. The god Enlil is angry, yes, but why? The noise of humanity is the reason given, but is that all? The texts do not elaborate, they do not explore, they state the fact and move on, as if the flood is simply part of the pattern, something that happens, something that has always happened. In the Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving flood narrative, the text is fragmentary. Literally, the tablet is broken, sections are missing. But even in what remains, the flood is not described in detail, it is mentioned. And then, after it, kingship is re-established. Cities are rebuilt, life continues. The flood is a rupture, but it is not dwelt upon. It is not mourned, it is absorbed, incorporated, made part of the cycle. This cyclical understanding of time is central to how the Sumerians seem to have understood the past. Time was not a straight line moving from origin to destiny. It was a wheel. Seasons repeated, floods came and went, kings rose and fell, dynasties replaced one another. But the structure remained, the gods remained, the temples remained, the land remained, and so memory did not need to preserve every detail, because the details would repeat. A flood in one era was like a flood in another. A king in one city was like a king in another. What mattered was not the unique event, but the pattern, the archetype. And so the texts preserve patterns, not particulars. They give us kings with impossibly long reigns, not to record literal history, but to signal something else. Antiquity, legitimacy, connection to the divine. The point is not that King Alulim actually ruled for 8,800 years. The point is that his rule was ancient, beyond human memory, beyond question. But if time is cyclical, if the past repeats, then what need is there to remember it fully? If this flood is like the last flood, and will be like the next flood, then why preserve the details? Why describe the rain, the rising water, the desperate cries of the drowning? Why name the lost? Why count the dead? It is enough to know that the flood came, that it ended, that kingship descended again. The function of the memory is not to commemorate, it is to orient, to say, this has happened before, it will happen again, we survived it then, we will survive it now. And so the texts are not elegies, they are maps, guides, instructions in the grammar of survival. And in this context, forgetting is not a failure, it is a feature. To forget the details of trauma is to be able to move forward. To forget the names of the dead is to avoid the weight of mourning them. To forget the cause of collapse is to avoid the paralysis of understanding it. The past becomes lighter when it is simplified, when it is reduced to symbol and pattern. And so the scribes, consciously or not, curated the past. They decided what would be baked into clay and what would remain in the air, in the spoken word, in the ephemeral and the lost. There is a moment in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the most complete narratives to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, where the hero confronts the question of memory directly. Gilgamesh is a king, 2/3 god, 1/3 human, the text tells us. He is restless, arrogant, he oppresses his people, and so the gods create Enkidu, a wild man, to challenge him. The two fight, then they become friends, brothers, they go on adventures together, they kill the monster Humbaba, they slay the bull of heaven, but then Enkidu dies, killed by the gods as punishment for their arrogance. And Gilgamesh is shattered. For the first time, he understands mortality. His friend is gone, and he too will die. So Gilgamesh sets out on a journey. He will find Utnapishtim, the one human who survived the Great Flood, and was granted immortality by the gods. He will learn the secret. He will escape death. But when Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, after crossing deserts and mountains and the waters of death itself, the old man does not offer hope. He tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, how he was warned, how he built the boat, how he survived, and how, afterward, the gods granted him immortality as a unique gift, a gift that cannot be repeated. There is no secret, Utnapishtim says. There is no path for you. Death is the lot of humanity. It was decided long ago. Gilgamesh protests. He has come so far. He has endured so much. But Utnapishtim is unmoved. He offers Gilgamesh a test. Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Prove that you can conquer even sleep, the little death. And Gilgamesh tries. He sits down. He closes his eyes for just a moment, and when he opens them, 7 loaves of bread have been baked beside him, 1 for each day he slept. He failed without even knowing it, and so he understands. Mortality is not something to be overcome. It is woven into the fabric of being human, but the story does not end there. Utnapishtim's wife takes pity on Gilgamesh. She tells him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that restores youth. Not immortality, but a second chance. Gilgamesh dives. He finds the plant. He holds it in his hands. He will bring it back to Uruk, he says. He will share it with his people. He will become young again. He will have time. But on the journey home, Gilgamesh stops to bathe in a pool, and while he is in the water, a serpent smells the plant. The serpent eats it, and as it slithers away, it sheds its skin, renewed, young again, and Gilgamesh is left with nothing. He sits by the water and weeps, not in rage, not in despair, but in acceptance. He has lost everything, his friend, his chance at immortality, his second youth, and all he can do is return home, to the city he built, to the walls he raised, to the life that remains. The text says he looked at the walls of Uruk, he touched the bricks, he marvelled at their foundations, and he understood that this, the work of his hands, the city that would outlast him, this was his immortality, not personal survival, but the survival of what he built, the survival of memory held in stone. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Sumerian worldview. Humanity is mortal, the gods are not. Humans work, the gods rest. Humans die, the gods endure. And nothing can change this. No amount of strength or wisdom or devotion can alter the fundamental structure. The best a human can do is accept it, to live within the boundaries, to build what can be built, to serve what must be served, and to let go of the rest. This is not a teaching of despair, it is a teaching of limits, and limits, the texts suggest, are what make meaning possible. If humans lived forever, there would be no urgency, no need to build, no need to love, no need to remember. It is precisely because life is short that anything matters at all. But there is another layer, a deeper question the texts gesture toward but never fully answer. If humanity was created to serve the gods, if the purpose of human existence is labour, then what came before? Before the creation of humans, the gods themselves laboured. They dug the rivers, they cleared the fields, they bore the weight of maintaining the world. This is stated clearly in Atrahasis and other texts. The gods were tired, they were resentful, and so they created a substitute. But this raises a question the texts never address. If the gods are immortal and all-powerful, why did they need to labour at all? Why did the world require such work? Who or what imposed this necessity upon them? The texts are silent. They begin with the assumption of labour. They begin with the assumption of hierarchy. The cosmos is already ordered. The roles are already assigned. There is no moment of pure freedom, no moment of unconditioned existence. Even the gods are bound by something, by rules they did not make, by forces they cannot name. And if the gods are bound, then what binds them? The texts do not say. Perhaps the scribes did not know, or perhaps they knew and chose not to write it. Because to write it would be to question the entire structure, to ask, if even the gods are not free, then what is the source of the order we live within? And that question, once asked, cannot be easily contained. Consider the figure of Enki, the god of wisdom, the god of fresh water, the god who, in text after text, acts as the protector of humanity. When Enlil sends the plague, Enki teaches humans to pray to the plague god. When Enlil sends the drought, Enki opens the underground waters. When Enlil sends the flood, Enki warns Atrahasis. Enki is the trickster, the boundary crosser, the one who bends the rules without quite breaking them. He does not oppose the other gods openly. He does not stage a rebellion. But he subverts. He finds loopholes. He whispers instructions through the walls of a reed house so that technically he has not spoken directly to a human. He is clever, and the texts celebrate this cleverness, but they also contain it. Enki helps humanity survive, but he does not free humanity. He does not grant them equality. He does not tear down the hierarchy. He simply makes the burden a little lighter, a little more bearable, and in doing so he ensures that the system continues, because if humanity were destroyed, the gods would have to labour again, and that more than compassion may be the reason Enki intervenes, not out of love, but out of necessity, because the gods need humanity as much as humanity needs the gods. This interdependence is rarely spoken aloud in the texts, but it is there, implicit, structural. The gods created humans to serve them, but in creating servants, they created a dependency. They bound themselves to the survival of their creation, and so the relationship is not simply one of master and slave. It is more complex, more fragile. The gods have power, yes, but they also have need, and need is a form of vulnerability. And there is another absence, another silence. In all the Sumerian texts, in all the myths and hymns and king lists, there is almost no mention of what we would call prehistory. No long narrative of human development. No description of early humans learning to make fire or tools or language. Humans appear, fully formed, already speaking, already organised into cities and labour forces. This is strange, because we know from archaeology that there were humans in Mesopotamia long before the first cities, long before writing. There were hunter-gatherers, there were early farmers, there were communities that built temples before they built palaces, but the texts ignore all of this, or rather, they skip over it, as if it does not matter, as if history, real history, only begins when cities begin, when writing begins, when the gods, through their representatives, the kings and priests impose order upon the world. This is not accidental. The texts are products of urban civilization. They are written by scribes who live in cities, who serve institutions, who benefit from the order those institutions provide. To them, the pre-urban past is not history. It is prehistory. It is chaos. It is the time before time, and it is not worth recording, or perhaps it is not safe to record, because to acknowledge that humans once lived differently, that they once existed without kings or temples or scribes, would be to suggest that these things are not inevitable, that they are choices, constructions, and that perhaps they could be unmade. So the texts begin in medias res, in the middle of things, with the world already ordered, and they present this order as natural, as given by the gods, as eternal, even though, on some level, the scribes must have known it was not eternal, because they themselves recorded the collapse of dynasties, the fall of cities, the floods and droughts and invasions that punctuated history. They knew that nothing lasts, and yet they wrote as if it would, as if the structure, even if its particulars changed, would endure forever. And perhaps this is the deepest function of these texts, not to record what happened, but to create a sense of permanence in the face of impermanence, to say, the world is ordered, the gods are in control, you have a place, you have a role, and as long as you fulfill it, the structure will hold. This is memory as stabilization, memory as reassurance, memory as a spell against chaos, but chaos keeps breaking through, in the gaps, in the silences, in the fragments. There are texts that survive only in pieces, tablets broken by time or violence or neglect, and sometimes these breaks are more revealing than the intact passages, because they show us what was lost, what was not copied, what was not considered important enough to preserve, and they show us that the act of remembering is always also an act of forgetting. To choose what to write is to choose what not to write. To preserve one story is to let another fade, and the scribes made these choices constantly, every time they sat down with a stylus and a lump of wet clay. There is a text called the Sumerian Temple Hymns, a collection of short hymns, each dedicated to a different temple in a different city. Each hymn praises the temple, describes its beauty, its power, its divine patron. But the hymns do not describe the labour that built the temples. They do not name the workers who hauled the mud bricks, who dug the foundations, who plastered the walls, The workers are invisible. The hymns are addressed to the gods and the temples, not to the humans who made them possible. And this too is a choice, a decision about what matters, about who matters. The gods matter. The kings matter. The priests and scribes matter. But the labourers, the ones who bore the weight, are erased, not out of cruelty necessarily, but out of a worldview in which their labour is simply expected, natural, beneath notice, like the work of oxen or donkeys, essential but not worth commemorating. And yet occasionally something breaks through, a complaint, a protest, a moment where the voice of the labourer is briefly heard. In one Sumerian text, a dialogue between a man and his god, the speaker laments his suffering. He has served faithfully. He has made offerings. He has done everything required. And yet he is poor. He is sick. He is scorned. Why, he asks, do the wicked prosper while the righteous suffer? Why does the god not intervene? The god's response is not recorded. Or perhaps it was never written. The text breaks off. The question hangs in the air, unanswered. And this too feels deliberate. Because there is no good answer. No answer that would justify the suffering without undermining the order. And so the question is allowed to exist, but not to be resolved. It is contained, acknowledged, but not addressed. A pressure valve, a way to let the complaint be spoken without letting it become dangerous. This is memory as control, but it is also memory as negotiation. The scribes were not fools. They knew the system was unjust. They knew that the labourers suffered. They knew that the gods, if they existed, did not visibly intervene to protect the faithful. But they also knew that to say this openly, to record it plainly, would be to invite collapse. And so they developed a language of indirection, of silence, of implication. They wrote in ways that could be read multiple ways, that could comfort the powerful and console the powerless, that could affirm the structure while quietly admitting its failures. And this is why the texts feel so strange to us now, why they seem to begin in the middle, why they seem to leave so much unsaid. Because they were never meant to be complete. They were meant to be sufficient, sufficient to maintain the order, sufficient to train new scribes, sufficient to justify the temples and the palaces and the labour obligations, sufficient to keep the wheel turning, and anything more than sufficient was dangerous. Because too much memory is a burden. Too much truth is a threat, and so the texts give us just enough to orient ourselves, just enough to accept our place, just enough to continue. But there is one more silence, one more absence that haunts the Sumerian texts, and it is the most profound. In almost every Sumerian myth, in almost every cosmology, there is a moment before, a time before the gods, a time before the world was ordered. The texts call it the time when heaven and earth were not yet separated, when fresh water and salt water were still mingled, when nothing had been named. This is the primordial state, the chaos before creation. And the texts describe it briefly at the beginning of creation myths, but they do not explain what it was. They do not describe what existed in that chaos. They simply state that it was there, and then the gods emerged, and they separated the waters, and they named the earth and the sky, and order began. But where did the gods come from? The texts do not say. Apsu and Tiamat, the primordial waters, give birth to other gods. But who gave birth to Apsu and Tiamat? The texts are silent, as if before them there was nothing, or as if what came before them cannot be spoken, cannot be known. And this silence is not accidental. It is foundational. Because to ask what came before the gods is to ask whether the gods are truly eternal, whether they are truly all-powerful, whether they are truly the source of order. And if they are not, if they themselves came from something else, then the entire cosmology begins to unravel. The hierarchy begins to lose its divine sanction, and so the silence is necessary. The silence is structural. It protects the system from its own origins, and this is what the Sumerian texts teach us in the end. Not that memory is precious, not that the past must be preserved at all costs, but that memory is dangerous, that it must be managed, that some things are better left unwritten, some questions better left unasked, because to remember everything is to risk understanding everything, and to understand everything is to see the cracks in the foundation, to see that the order is not natural, that the hierarchy is not eternal, that the gods, if they exist, are not omnipotent. and that humanity, for all its suffering and limitation, is not as powerless as it has been taught to believe. There is a tablet, broken and fragmentary, found among the ruins of the ancient city of Nippur. It contains part of a myth that is now called the Eridu Genesis. It is one of the oldest flood narratives we possess, older than the version in Gilgamesh, older than Atrahasis in its current form, and what survives of it is striking not for what it says, but for what it assumes the reader already knows. The tablet begins not with the creation of the world, but with the world already in motion, cities already exist, humans already live in them, kingship has already descended from heaven, and then, without preamble, without explanation, the gods decide to send a flood. The reason is lost. The tablet is damaged. We do not know what the humans did, if anything. We do not know why the gods were angry. We only know that they acted. And that one man, whose name is also lost in the break, was warned. He built a boat. He survived. And after the flood, the gods regretted their decision. They wept. They swore never to do it again. And kingship descended once more. But here is what is strange. The flood is not treated as an anomaly. It is not presented as a unique event that shattered the normal order of things. It is presented as part of a pattern. Something that happened. Something that implicitly could happen again. The text does not dwell on the horror of it. It does not describe the rising waters in detail. It does not name the drowned. It moves through the event quickly, almost perfunctorily, as if the flood were a given, a known quantity. And this suggests something profound about the Sumerian understanding of catastrophe. Catastrophe was not exceptional. It was structural. It was woven into the fabric of existence. The world was not stable. It was not safe. And the gods who ruled it were not benevolent. They were powerful. And power, in the Sumerian worldview, was not the same as goodness. This is a hard teaching. A cold teaching. And it runs through the text like a dark thread. The gods are not loving parents. They are not guardians who protect their children. They are rulers, distant, unpredictable, dangerous. They must be appeased. They must be fed. They must be praised. Not because they deserve it, but because they demand it. And the price of failing to appease them is destruction, not personal damnation, not hell. The Sumerians did not have a concept of hell as we understand it, but annihilation, erasure, the flood that wipes away cities, names and memories, the plague that empties the streets, the famine that turns the fields to dust. These are the tools of the gods, and humans live always in their shadow. And yet, humans continue. They rebuild, they replant, they have children, they tell stories, and this too is part of the pattern. Destruction is followed by renewal, not because the gods will it necessarily, but because survival is what humans do. It is their nature, their function. They were made to labour, and labour means endurance. It means carrying forward even when the burden is unbearable, even when the memory of loss is still fresh. The texts do not celebrate this as heroism. They present it as simple fact. Humanity endures because humanity must endure, because there is no alternative. But what does it mean to endure? What does it mean to continue after everything has been taken away, after the flood has swept over, after the city has fallen, after the names of the dead have been forgotten? The text suggests that endurance requires a kind of forgetting, not a complete erasure of the past, but a selective dimming, a softening of the sharpest edges. The flood becomes a story, the dead become ancestors, the trauma becomes myth. And in becoming myth, it becomes bearable. Myth is not falsehood, it is transformation. It is the process by which unbearable truth is translated into a form that can be carried forward, a form that can be spoken aloud, a form that can be written down, and a form that over time becomes detached from the specific pain of the specific moment. The flood in the text is not anyone's flood, it is everyone's flood. It is the flood that always comes, and because it is archetypal, it is survivable. Because it has been survived before, this is why the texts are so spare, so minimal. They do not elaborate, they do not describe, they do not invite the reader to feel the cold water rising, to hear the screams, to imagine the desperate scramble for high ground. They state the fact. The flood came, the flood ended, life continued, and by stripping away the detail, they strip away the immediacy. They make the event distant, manageable, safe to remember. Because if every generation had to carry the full weight of every catastrophe, no generation would be able to move forward. The weight would be too great, the sorrow too deep. And so the texts perform a kind of mercy. They remember, but they remember selectively. They preserve the outline, but let the substance fade. And in doing so, they make survival possible. But there is a cost. There is always a cost. What is lost when the details are lost? What is forgotten when only the pattern remains? The individuals certainly. The specific lives that were lived and lost. The names that were spoken and then fell silent. The loves and fears and hopes that were unique to each person. All of this is erased. Not maliciously, but inevitably. Because the archive is finite. The clay is limited. The scribe's time is limited. And so choices must be made. What is essential? What is worth preserving? And the answer, again and again, is the structure, the pattern, the function, not the individual, not the particular. The system remembers itself. It preserves the knowledge necessary for its own continuation. But the lives lived within the system, the quiet moments of joy or sorrow, the small rebellions and private griefs, these are let go. These are allowed to dissolve into the silence. And this silence is vast. Imagine the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of people who lived and died in Sumer across the centuries. Farmers, weavers, potters, fishermen, mothers, children, old men sitting in the shade, young women singing as they worked, all of them unnamed, all of them unrecorded. Their lives were full, their experiences were real. But they left no trace, or rather, they left only the faintest trace. A shard of pottery, a fragment of a wall, a grave with no inscription. They lived within history, but they are not part of history. Because history as it was written was not for them. It was for the kings, for the priests, for the gods. It was for those who had the power to command the scribes, and the scribes obeyed. But here and there, in unexpected places, something breaks through. A prayer, a lament, a moment where the voice of an ordinary person is briefly preserved. There is a text, a letter written on clay, from a woman to her family. She complains that they have not sent her the wool she needs. She is cold. She is worried. She asks them to remember her. And we do not know her name. We do not know if they sent the wool. We do not know how her story ended. But for a moment, across more than 4,000 years, we hear her. And she is not mythic. She is not archetypal. She is specific. She is real. And she is asking to be remembered. And in that moment, the silence breaks, the pattern cracks, and we see briefly what is usually hidden. The human beneath the structure, the life beneath the system, the individual who was never meant to be recorded but who, by accident or grace, was. And this is the tragedy. Not that people died. Death is inevitable, but that they were forgotten, that their lives, which mattered to them, which were the whole world to them, left no mark. And the texts, the official texts, do not mourn this. They do not even acknowledge it. Because to acknowledge it would be to question the logic of the archive, to ask, if these lives mattered, why are they not remembered? And if they are not remembered, did they matter? These are dangerous questions, questions that threaten the legitimacy of the entire system, and so the texts avoid them. They focus on the kings, on the temples, on the gods, on the structures that endure, and they let the rest fall away. But the silence is not complete. Because we, now, thousands of years later, can see what the texts do not say. We can read the gaps. We can feel the weight of the unrecorded. We can imagine the woman waiting for wool, the labourer hauling bricks, the child playing in the street of a city that will one day be dust. And in imagining them, we remember them, not as they were, because we cannot know that, but as they might have been. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all memory can ever do. Not recover the past, but honour it. Not bring it back, but acknowledge that it was there, that it mattered, even if no one wrote it down. Now we must turn to a different kind of silence. Not the silence of the forgotten, but the silence of the forbidden. The things that were known but not written. The knowledge that was kept oral. The secrets that were guarded. Because the Sumerian texts make it clear again and again that not all knowledge was public. Not all wisdom was shared. There were mysteries. There were rites performed behind closed doors. There were words spoken only in the inner sanctum of the temple, and these were never recorded, or if they were recorded, the tablets were kept hidden, restricted, accessible only to those who had been initiated, who had been deemed worthy. We know this because the texts themselves tell us. They describe rituals but do not explain their meaning. They list offerings but do not reveal what the offerings are meant to accomplish. They name gods but do not fully describe their powers. The language is elusive, indirect. It assumes that the reader already knows, or that the reader does not need to know. And this is intentional. The texts are gates. They open for some and remain closed for others. And who decides who may enter? The priests, the scribes, the keepers of the archive, those who have the authority to interpret, to explain, to grant access. Knowledge, in this system, is not democratic. It is hierarchical, and the hierarchy is maintained by controlling the flow of information, by deciding who knows what, by keeping certain truths hidden, and what truths were hidden. We cannot know for certain because they were hidden, but we can infer. The creation myths, for instance, exist in multiple versions. Some are more explicit than others. Some describe the birth of the gods in detail, others skip over it, and this variation suggests that there were different levels of teaching, an outer teaching for the general population, and an inner teaching for the initiated. The outer teaching says, the gods created the world. The gods rule. Obey, and you will be blessed. Disobey, and you will be punished. This is simple, clear, manageable. But the inner teaching, the one hinted at in the more complex texts, is darker. It suggests that the gods themselves are limited, that they struggle, that they make mistakes, that they are not omniscient or omnipotent, that they too are subject to forces they do not fully control. And this knowledge, if widely known, would be dangerous. It would undermine the authority of the priests who speak for the gods. It would invite questions, doubt, rebellion. And so it was kept hidden, shared only with those who could be trusted not to misuse it. But even this inner teaching may not be the deepest layer. There are hints scattered through the texts of something older, something that came before the gods, before the ordering of the cosmos, before the separation of heaven and earth. The texts call it the primordial chaos, the time of unnaming, the time when nothing was fixed, when nothing was determined. And they suggest very quietly that this chaos is not gone, it is not defeated, it is suppressed, held back, kept at bay by the order the gods impose, but it is still there, still pressing against the boundaries, still threatening to break through. And this is why the rituals must be performed, why the offerings must be made, why the prayers must be spoken, not to honor the gods exactly, but to maintain the order, to keep the chaos from returning, to hold the world together. And if this is true, if the order is not eternal but must be constantly maintained, constantly renewed, then the entire structure is revealed as fragile, contingent, dependent on human action. And this too is dangerous knowledge, because it means that humans have power, not the power to overthrow the gods, but the power to let the order collapse, to stop performing the rituals, to stop making the offerings, to stop believing. And if enough people did this, if enough people turned away, what would happen? Would the gods punish them? Or would the order simply dissolve? Would the chaos return? The texts do not answer. They cannot answer, because to answer would be to reveal too much, to give away the game, and so they remain silent. They hint, they imply, but they do not explain. And perhaps the scribes themselves did not fully understand. Perhaps they too were working with fragments, with traditions passed down across generations, with stories whose original meanings had been lost or transformed. Perhaps they wrote what they were taught to write, repeated what they were taught to repeat, and trusted that the system which had endured for so long would continue to endure, that the rituals would keep working, that the gods would keep listening, that the chaos would keep staying away. They did not know for certain, but they had faith, not faith in the sense of belief, but faith in the sense of commitment. They would do their part, they would write the texts, they would train the next generation of scribes, they would maintain the archive, and they would trust that this was enough. But was it? The cities of Sumer did not last forever. Ur fell, Uruk fell, Nippur fell. The dynasties collapsed. The temples were abandoned. The gods, if they existed, did not intervene, and the texts, the carefully preserved texts, ended up buried under sand and rubble, forgotten for thousands of years, until archaeologists dug them up and scholars learned to read them again, and now we have them. These fragments, these silences, these hints at knowledge that was never fully recorded, and we try to understand. We try to piece together the worldview of people who lived so long ago, who thought so differently, who faced problems we can barely imagine, and we do our best. But we too are working with fragments. We too are filling in the gaps, making inferences, guessing. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps memory is always incomplete, always selective, always a collaboration between the past and the present, between what was written and what we choose to read into it. There is a hymn carved into clay more than 4,000 years ago that praises the goddess Inanna. It describes her beauty, her power, her terrible wrath. But near the end, the hymn shifts. It addresses the reader directly. It says, "Who can understand the heart of the goddess? Who can know her ways?" And then it falls silent. The question is not answered. It hangs in the air like smoke, and this is how so many of these texts end. Not with resolution, not with certainty, but with uncertainty. With the admission that some things cannot be known, that some doors cannot be opened, that some mysteries must remain mysteries. This is not a failure of knowledge. It is a statement about the limits of knowledge. The Sumerians understood, perhaps better than we do, that the world is larger than human comprehension, that there are forces at work beyond our control, beyond our understanding, and that to pretend otherwise, to claim complete knowledge, complete mastery, is dangerous. It is hubris, and hubris in the Sumerian texts is always punished. Not because the gods are petty, but because the world has boundaries, rules, limits that cannot be crossed without consequence, and these limits apply to everyone, gods and humans alike. Even the great hero Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, could not escape death. Even Inanna, the queen of heaven, could not enter the underworld without being stripped of her power. The texts repeat this lesson again and again. There are thresholds you cannot cross. There are truths you cannot speak. There are memories you cannot keep. And so the texts teach acceptance, not passive resignation, but active acceptance. The recognition that some things are beyond your power to change, that some losses are inevitable, that some knowledge is forbidden not because it is evil, but because it is too heavy to carry, because it would crush you, because it would make life impossible, and so you let it go. You accept the limits. You work within the boundaries. You do what you can do, and you let the rest fall into silence. But there is one more layer to uncover, one more silence to examine, and it is perhaps the most important. Throughout all these texts, throughout all these myths and hymns and laments, there is almost no mention of individual interiority. We are rarely told what a character thinks or feels in the way we would expect in a modern narrative. When Gilgamesh loses Enkidu, we are told he weeps. We are told he tears his hair and his clothes. We are told he wanders in the wilderness. But we are not told in any detail what the grief feels like from the inside. We are shown the external signs, the actions, the consequences. But the internal experience remains hidden, unspoken. And this is not because the Sumerians did not have interior lives. Of course they did. They felt grief and joy and fear and love just as we do. But the texts do not record these feelings directly. They record behavior, action, function. Why? Perhaps because interior experience was considered private, personal, not the business of the archive. The archive records what is public, what is observable, what can be verified. A king ruled, a temple was built, a flood occurred. These are facts. But how someone felt about these facts, what they meant to them personally, this was ephemeral, subjective. It died with the person, and perhaps that was acceptable. Perhaps the Sumerians understood that memory cannot preserve everything, that to try to preserve the inner life, the felt experience of every person who ever lived would be impossible, and so they preserved what could be preserved, the outward, the structural, the enduring. But this means that when we read these texts, we are reading only half the story. We see the actions, but we do not see the actor. We see the ritual, but we do not see the belief. We see the law, but we do not see the feeling of being bound by it. And so we must imagine. We must fill in the silence. We must ask, what did it feel like to live in 5,000 years ago? To wake before dawn and walk through narrow streets to the temple? To make an offering of barley and beer to a god whose face you would never see? To work all day in the fields under the burning sun? To return home in the evening to a one-room house with the walls of mud brick? To eat bread and onions and dried fish? To tell stories to your children in the darkness? To wonder if this was all there was? To wonder if there was something more? And to never know for certain? The texts cannot tell us this, but they can tell us that these lives were lived, that these questions were asked, that the silence, the not knowing, was part of the human condition then just as it is now. And perhaps that is the deepest truth these fragments preserve, not the specifics of Sumerian cosmology, not the names of forgotten gods, but the recognition that uncertainty is fundamental, that mystery is inescapable, that we live always in the space between what we know and what we can never know, and that this space is where meaning is made. Consider the student in the Adaba, the tablet house, learning to write. He practices the same signs over and over hundreds of times, thousands of times. His fingers ache, his back hurts. The teacher strikes him when he makes a mistake, and he does not understand why he must learn this. He does not see the purpose. He is told only that it is necessary, that he must memorize, that he must copy, that he must not question, and perhaps he resents it. Perhaps he dreams of running away, of becoming a fisherman like his uncle, of living a simpler life. But he does not run. He stays. He learns. And eventually he becomes a scribe. He takes his place in the system. He writes receipts and contracts and hymns. He preserves the memory of the city. And perhaps, in time, he understands. Perhaps he sees that he is part of something larger than himself, that he is a link in a chain that stretches back into the past and forward into the future, that his labour, his suffering, his acceptance makes possible the continuation of the world he knows. Or perhaps he never understands. Perhaps he simply endures, does his work, grows old, dies, and is forgotten. We cannot know. The texts do not tell us, but they tell us that this process happened. That generation after generation, young men and occasionally young women were trained to be scribes, and that through their labour the archive was maintained. The memory was preserved, not all of it, not even most of it, but enough, just enough. And this sufficiency is what allowed Sumerian civilization to endure for more than 2,000 years. Longer than any modern nation has yet existed. Longer than most of us can imagine. And when it finally fell, when the cities were abandoned and the language was forgotten, the texts remained, buried, waiting, silent, until someone dug them up and read them again, and realized that we are still asking the same questions, still living in the same uncertainty, still trying to understand what it means to be human in a world that is larger and stranger and more dangerous than we can fully comprehend. And now we come to the question that has been implicit throughout this entire journey. Why do these texts matter now? What do they have to teach us here, in the 21st century, so far removed from the mud and the reeds, and the ziggurat temples of ancient Sumer? The answer is not simple, but it is there. These texts matter because they show us that our way of thinking about memory, about history, about the past is not universal. It is not inevitable. The Sumerians did not try to record everything. They did not believe that every detail mattered. They did not think that the goal of history was completeness. They understood that memory is a tool, a function, and that its purpose is not preservation for its own sake, but survival. The preservation of what is necessary, what is useful, what allows life to continue. We live in an age that is obsessed with memory. We record everything. We photograph every meal. We document every moment. We store vast amounts of data. We believe that if something is not recorded, it did not happen. That if someone is not remembered, they did not matter. And we are terrified of forgetting. We build monuments. We create archives. We write histories. We do everything we can to fight against the erasure of time. And there is nobility in this. There is love in this. The desire to honour the past, to remember the dead, to preserve what was lost. but there is also a kind of violence, a kind of tyranny. Because the more we remember, the heavier the burden becomes. The more we document, the more we have to carry. And at some point, the weight becomes unbearable. We cannot process it all. We cannot integrate it all. We become paralyzed by the sheer volume of memory, by the endless archive of suffering and loss and injustice that has accumulated over centuries, and we do not know how to move forward. The Sumerians offer a different model, not a better model, necessarily, not a model we should simply adopt, but a different one. They understood that forgetting is not always a failure, that sometimes it is a mercy, that sometimes it is necessary, that to carry forward we must let go, not of everything, but of enough to make the burden bearable, enough to allow us to continue. And they understood that what we choose to remember shapes who we become, that memory is not neutral, it is selective, it is political, it is moral, and that the question is not whether to forget, but what to forget, what to preserve and what to release, what to carry forward and what to leave behind. This is a hard teaching, perhaps the hardest, because it requires judgment, it requires choice, it requires taking responsibility for the shape of the future by deciding what we bring from the past. And there is no objective standard for making these choices, no algorithm, no formula, only wisdom, and wisdom is earned through suffering, through mistakes, through the slow accumulation of experience across generations. The Sumerians had this wisdom. They had endured floods and famines and invasions. They had seen cities rise and fall. They had watched dynasties come and go. And they had learned, through trial and terrible error, what needed to be remembered and what could be let go. And they encoded this knowledge in their texts, not explicitly, not in the form of rules or commandments, but implicitly, in the structure, in the silences, in what they chose to write and what they chose not to write. And now, at the end of this journey, we return to where we began, to the question of whether humanity was meant to remember everything, and the answer from the Sumerian texts is clear: no. Humanity was never meant to remember everything. Memory is not a sacred duty. It is a tool, a means, a way of carrying forward what is necessary for survival. And survival requires selectivity. It requires discernment. It requires the courage to let go. Not to forget in the sense of erasure, but to forget in the sense of release, to acknowledge the past, to honour it, and then to set it down, to allow it to recede, to let it become part of the silence that surrounds all things, because the silence is not empty. The silence is full of all the lives that were lived and lost, full of all the words that were spoken and never written, full of all the moments of joy and sorrow and love and fear that made up the vast, incomprehensible totality of human experience across millennia. And we cannot hold all of this. We were never meant to hold all of this. We can only hold a fragment, a trace, a whisper, and that is enough. The past fades, the clay tablets crumble, the cuneiform signs blur and become illegible, the cities turn to dust, the rivers change their courses, the languages are forgotten, and still something remains. Not a complete record, not a perfect preservation, but an echo, a resonance, a pattern that repeats across time. The flood comes, the flood recedes, life continues, not because we remember everything, but because we remember enough to rebuild, enough to replant, enough to tell our children that the world has ended before and will end again, and that this too shall pass, and that on the other side of destruction, there is always the possibility of renewal, not a return to what was, but the creation of something new, something shaped by memory but not bound by it, something that honours the past without being imprisoned by it. And tonight, as we close this meditation, as we let the story settle into silence, we are left not with answers, but with questions. What will we choose to remember? What will we choose to forget? What fragments will we preserve for those who come after? What silences will we maintain? And how will we live, knowing that we too will one day be fragments? That our names, our stories, our carefully preserved memories will fade into the vast archive of all that has been forgotten? Perhaps the answer is simple. Perhaps it has always been simple. We live, we love, we work, we suffer, we endure, and we let go. Not all at once, but gradually, gently. The way the light fades at the end of the day, The way the sound of voices fades when the speakers walk away. The way memory itself fades, not into darkness, but into a softer kind of knowing. A knowing that does not require details, that does not require names, that does not require proof. A knowing that simply says, this happened. People lived, they mattered, and now they are gone. And that is enough. The Sumerian texts do not give us closure. They do not tie up loose ends. They do not resolve the mysteries they raise. They simply end. Mid-sentence sometimes, mid-thought, and we are left in the silence that was always there, the silence that will always be there, the silence in which memory dissolves and meaning emerges, the silence in which we find not answers, but peace. And so we listen, not to what was said, but to what was left unsaid, not to the words on the clay, but to the space between the words, not to the story, but to the silence that surrounds the story and gives it shape. And in that silence, we hear something, not a voice, not a message, but a presence, the presence of all those who came before, who lived and died and were forgotten, who are forgotten still, and who will always be forgotten, and who, in their forgetting, made possible everything we are, everything we know, everything we carry forward, and as the night deepens, as the world grows quiet, we let ourselves rest, not in certainty, not in complete knowledge, but in the acceptance that we are part of something larger, something older, something that began long before us and will continue long after. We are fragments too, brief flickers of consciousness in the vast darkness of time, and when we are gone, only traces will remain, a few words, a few memories held by those who loved us, and then, eventually, not even that, just silence. And that is not tragic. That is not a failure. That is simply the way things are, the way things have always been, the way things were always meant to be. Sleep now. Let the questions fade. Let the stories settle. Let the past become what it was always meant to become. Not a burden, not a weight, but a foundation. Something to stand on, something to build from, something to remember just enough, and to forget just enough, so that tomorrow, when the sun rises, we can begin again. Not in ignorance, not in forgetfulness, but in the quiet wisdom that knows when to hold on and when to let go, when to preserve and when to release, when to remember and when to forget. The tablets are silent now, the scribes are gone, the temples are ruins, the gods, if they ever existed, have withdrawn, and we are left here, in the present, in the only moment we ever truly have, with the choice of what to carry forward and what to leave behind. And perhaps that choice is the truest form of memory, not the passive preservation of everything, but the active curation of meaning, the conscious decision to honour what matters, and to let the rest dissolve into the beautiful, necessary, merciful silence. And so we end where we began, in the silence, in the space, between words, in the recognition that humanity was never meant to remember everything, only what it needed to continue. And tonight we have listened. We have descended into deep time. We have walked among the fragments, and now we return, carrying with us not complete knowledge, not absolute truth, but something simpler, something quieter, something that needs no name, only recognition, only acceptance, only peace. Rest now. The past is still there. It always will be. But you do not need to carry it all. You were never meant to carry it all. Carry what you can, what feels true, what helps you continue, and let the rest go. Into the silence, into the darkness, into the vast, unknowable mystery from which all things come and to which all things return. Sleep well, and remember only this, that you are part of the chain, a link between what was and what will be, and that your life, however brief, however small, however forgotten it may one day become, matters now, in this moment, in this breath, in this quiet space between sleeping and waking, between remembering and forgetting, between the known and the unknowable. You are here, and that is enough.